Hey guys, tonight we're opening a gift that was never meant to be opened. Imagine this, you're at your own wedding, the biggest day of your life, and the most powerful man alive, let's call him Zeus, shows up. He smiles that polished, too perfect smile, and hands you a box. No bow, no instructions, just one rule: don't ever open it. That's not a gift, that's a trap. And deep down, you know it. Because the human heart, whether in the ancient world or right now, was never designed to walk away from a locked door. That's why the story of Pandora has haunted people for thousands of years. It's more than just a bedtime story whispered under candlelight. It's the original warning label, the ancient terms and conditions nobody actually reads. Tonight, we're going to step into the shadows of Greek mythology and listen for the whispers that escape when curiosity wins over fear. Think about it. Every legend has that one moment where everything changes. For Adam and Eve, it was the apple. For Icarus, it was the wings. For Pandora, it was a bronze box humming like a secret heartbeat on her kitchen table. 3 days, 3 nights, and every second she swore she wouldn't touch it. The whispers grew louder. If you've ever stared at a glowing notification on your phone at 2 a.m, knowing you shouldn't tap it, you've lived a piece of Pandora's agony. And here's the twist: people forget the box wasn't full of punishments. Not exactly. What spilled out was more complicated, more human grief, hunger, war, but also invention, courage, and the ability to dream of something beyond survival. The gods didn't just curse Pandora. They gave her the burden of choice, the same burden all of us carry, whether to open our eyes to the truth or keep them safely shut. Tonight's story is about that burden, and about the one thing that stayed behind when everything else escaped hope. Not a fluffy, Hallmark card kind of hope. No. This was darker, quieter, more stubborn. The kind of hope that clings to you when you've got nothing left, when the night feels endless, when history itself seems written only in blood. It's the kind of hope that keeps people listening to stories like this, stories that refuse to look away from the ugly, but still promise that somewhere in the dark, a single candle can burn. So, what can you expect as we wander through this myth together? You'll see Pandora not as a villain or a fool, but as the first woman in history to say, "I will not live in ignorance." You'll meet farmers who carried hope up steep mountains, children who reshaped empires with tiny acts of defiance, and outcasts who found dignity in places the gods forgot. And all of it will come back to that box, that whisper, and the truth no god could silence. This isn't the clean, polished version of Greek mythology they teach in school. This is the messy version, the raw version, the version that sounds a little too much like our own lives when we're honest. The mistakes, the betrayals, the resilience, those are the things that actually help us fall asleep, not because they're boring, but because they remind us that chaos has always been here, and somehow people have always endured it. So, if you came looking for a soft landing into the night, you're in the right place. If you came for something darker, something that feels more real, you're also in the right place. Tonight, the whispers of Pandora's box will slip into your room, not to scare you, but to remind you even when everything else escapes, hope stays, and that whisper is enough to carry you through the night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning in Pandora's Valley was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet, more like the silence before a storm. Epimetheus was gone before sunrise, his back bent to the olive groves. The little house left behind was so ordinary: clay walls, a roof patched with straw, a table worn from years of elbows and breadcrumbs that the box in the corner looked absurd, like a jewel sitting in a barn, bronze, polished, humming faintly even in the daylight. It was a gift from Zeus, the kind of gift that felt less like generosity and more like a dare. One instruction: do not open it. That's the kind of line that never works, not on children, not on drunks, and certainly not on the first woman ever created by the gods. Pandora tried to ignore it. She swept the dust, folded the linens, braided her hair until her scalp burned. She studied the way the shutters groaned when the wind shifted. But the box was always there. It pulsed in the corner like a migraine, impossible to forget. At night she swore she heard whispers, not words, but that eerie hum you hear in your ears when a room is too still. The kind of sound that makes you wonder if you're listening to the world or just to your own skull. If you've ever tried not to think about something, you know the harder you push it away, the louder it comes back. By the fourth day, her reflection in the wash basin scared her. The woman who stared back had hollow eyes and cracked lips. This was the perfect woman shaped by the gods. They had given her Athena's wit, Aphrodite's grace, Hermes' voice, and then chained it all to a command no one could keep. It was a cruel joke, and she laughed once, bitterly, at the thought. Imagine crafting someone curious, then punishing them for curiosity. Classic Zeus. She tried to share her thoughts with Epimetheus over dinner. "Why do you think they gave it to us?" she asked, her finger tracing the rim of his cup. He didn't even look up from his bread. The gods do what they do. That was all. Epimetheus could endure anything: cold winters, hard labour, long silence. Anything. Apparently, except a real conversation. Pandora bit her tongue until it bled. That night, with the crickets screaming and the oil lamp guttering, she sat by the box. The bronze caught the light in strange shapes, spirals that seemed to move when she wasn't looking straight at them. She thought she heard laughter inside children, maybe, or echoes of voices drowned out by time. It didn't scare her. What scared her was how badly she wanted to press her ear closer. Her hand brushed the lid. She froze. She wasn't ready to open it yet. Instead, she whispered, "I hear you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Epimetheus coughed in his sleep, turned over, and kept snoring. She leaned close again. "What are you?" The box answered with nothing but a shift in the air, a cold draft across her cheek as though a window had opened. She pulled back, heart hammering. The moment passed, and the room was warm again. She sat there until the lamp died, too shaken to move. Morning brought no relief. Epimetheus left without noticing the dark circles under her eyes. She sat at the table, staring at the box, and realized she no longer thought of it as the box. It was someone, an intruder or a guest, she couldn't decide which. Fear and tenderness tangled inside her chest, the way you feel when you hold an injured bird that might bite if it survives. People say temptation shrinks when ignored. Anyone who's laid awake at 3 a.m. knows that's a lie. It doesn't shrink, it multiplies. She started testing herself, an hour without looking at it, a small touch as a reward. The bronze was always warm, as if it remembered sunlight even in the dark. One evening she swore she saw a face flicker on the surface, not hers. Older, sharper, watching. She jerked back, knocking over her stool. Epimetheus called from the doorway, irritated. What now? Nothing. She lied. By the week's end, she was unravelling. Hair tangled, hands trembling, whispering little songs to herself to drown out the not-so-faint murmurs. And yet, there was a thrill in it. For once she wasn't just another woman with chores and children to raise. For once, she held a secret no one else could imagine. She wasn't ordinary. She was chosen, and that feeling grew. In ancient Greece, women's lives were confined. Marriage arranged, voices silenced in public gatherings, their names often missing from the records. Pandora knew none of her neighbours carried a secret like this. None of them wrestled with a mystery dropped in their lap by gods themselves. That thought gave her a strange pride, as if she'd been singled out not for punishment, but for purpose. On the 7th night, she pressed her ear against the lid. The sounds inside had shape now, like wind through cracks, like water pushing at stone. Then, faint but undeniable, she caught a phrase set us free. Her body went rigid. She pulled back, shaking, breath sharp in her throat. She stared at the box until her eyes burned. Then, with a calmness that felt alien, she whispered back, "Not yet." But the whispers clung to her, growing sharper the more she resisted. She imagined herself lifting the lid just a finger's width, enough to glimpse what lived inside. Her hands twitched. She nearly reached for it when a crash outside startled her. Epimetheus dropping his tools. She jumped back from the box like a guilty child caught red-handed. Her breath came in ragged bursts. The urge lingered like static under her skin. Back in bed, she tried to sleep, but images poured through her head. Sickness crawling through streets, hunger gnawing at bellies, wars carved into maps. Yet braided into those horrors were sparks, music echoing from temples. Colours painted on stone. Fire shaping the night. The box could end them, or begin them. The gods had given her the cruelest puzzle. Was she protecting the world by keeping it closed, or starving it by keeping it shut? Epimetheus snored, blissfully oblivious. Pandora turned her face to the wall, eyes wide open. The box pulsed behind her like a second heartbeat. She matched its rhythm without meaning to, and in that suffocating stillness, she finally understood the question wasn't if she would open it. The question was when. She knew then it was only a matter of time. Morning did not reset anything. It made the choice sharper. Pandora set bread she did not touch, filled the lamp though the sun was up, and shut the shutters until the room held only her breath and the steady pulse of the box. She laid both hands on the bronze and felt warmth gather, not dangerous, almost kind. Easier to call this an accident, she thought. Easier to say the lid slipped. Easier to pretend. A whisper rose from inside, thin, urgent, inevitable. She slid the latch free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a thread of air, cold and clean, wound up through the seam like the first smell of the rain. Something brushed her face and did not hurt. She lifted the lid a finger's width. The room exhaled. It did not explode. It unfolded. Shapes like heavy dust spun into the light, each with a weight more idea than thing. Grief was first grey and familiar, settling on her shoulders like a shawl. Hunger followed, a thin ribbon tightening and then letting go. War-chimed rust and smoke. Sickness, small and patient, counted quietly in the corner. Pandora flinched and still did not close the lid. The shapes flowed past without malice, not seeking her, not even seeing her. They moved like weather, indifferent and complete. Braided through them came things she had not expected. Curiosity slipped out, laughing softly, tapping a cup with a musician's ear. Invention crawled after, collecting crumbs of problem and stacking them into answers. Courage squeezed her fingers and was gone, leaving a warmth that did not fade. She opened the lid wider. Voices filled the room, some weeping, some singing, some arguing like old friends. The house felt larger, as if every wall had stepped back. Time tilted and returned. There was pain. Sickness slipped its cool hand behind her neck and she tasted metal. Grief ran down her face without asking. A shard of war nicked her thumb. A bead of blood opened like a rose. She wanted to slam the lid, but there is no taking back the first breath of a storm once the wind finds the door. Besides, this was not poison poured into a clean world. This was a lantern in a cave. The shapes had always been here. Naming them only made them visible. A sound like the sea at night rose under the rest. One voice remained, not loud, not soft. The tone a friend uses when they mean it. She bent closer. "Are you the last?" she asked. "I am the thread," the voice said, and she felt it before she understood it, like a steady hand in the dark. A porch light left on, a breath that keeps rhythm when the body forgets how. Hope did not sweep grief away. It braided through it. It did not cure hunger. It sharpened the taste of bread. It did not end war. It made the long work of mending possible. A promise without a deadline. She laughed then, a small, cracked sound, because she had expected a miracle or a punishment and had received something stranger company. Not the gods' kind, distant, but the kind that sits with you until morning, outside. Metal clattered. Epimetheus had dropped a bucket. Reflex snapped through her arm, and the lid tipped wider than she meant. The voices surged, a wind through a narrow pass. Shadows fled the house like birds startled from a tree. Pandora pressed the lid down, not out of obedience but to steady the room. The latch caught. Silence returned, not empty, but like the quiet after a choir holds its note and lets it fade. She kept her hands on the bronze until it cooled. She was not the same. For a while she did nothing. She washed the blood from her thumb, ate the bread that had gone hard, and opened a shutter to let a bar of noon cross the table. The air smelled of olives and smoke. No lightning split the valley. No god filled the doorway to tally her sin. If you came here for tidy, you won't find it, she thought. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was ruined in a way it had not already been. What changed was the lighting. What changed was that the names were said out loud. And once you can name a thing, you're less afraid to touch it. She faced the box. "I heard you," she said, meaning all of them, meaning the one. I will keep listening. When Epimetheus came in, he paused at the thickness of the air. He looked at the box and then at her face. Something different, he asked. Dinner first, she said, and surprised herself by laughing. Then we'll talk. He nodded and went to wash his hands. Pandora set out olives, poured water, and broke the loaf in a clean, firm line. Her heart still beat hard, but it had steadied. She did not feel smaller for what she had done. She felt size to it, like a door that finally fits its frame. Night would come, and with it echoes. There would be a light somewhere, and a seat at the table, and breath enough to tell the truth again when it asked. She did not know the cost yet. She did not know the gifts. She knew only this: not all openings are disasters. Some are beginnings polite enough to knock. That night, the house didn't feel the same. The air was heavy but alive, as if the walls themselves had listened. Pandora lay awake beside Epimetheus, staring into the dark, certain that the box had not gone silent, only quieter, the way a river calms after a storm but keeps flowing underneath. Every breath carried the ghost of what she had released. Grief still lingered on her skin like ash, and yet beneath it, stubborn and steady, was the whisper that refused to leave hope. She turned on her side and pressed her palm against the lid. The bronze was cool now, but it vibrated faintly, like the echo of a song long after the singer had stopped. Hope did not rush her, did not plead. It waited. That was its power. By morning, something had shifted in her. Bread tasted less like ash. Water cut sharper against her tongue. Even Epimetheus seemed to notice. "You look different," he muttered, though he said it the way one comments on the weather, not as a question. She smiled but didn't explain. Some truths weren't for him. Not yet. The valley carried on as it always did, men in the groves, women at their looms, children chasing each other in the dust. But Pandora saw layers now, behind every face, a shadow or a shimmer. Grief clung to the widow down the road, heavy but not crushing. Courage flickered in the boy balancing on a fence. Even invention teased from the smithy where sparks flew. The world was not a clean place before she opened the box. It was only unnamed. Now it hummed with identity, and hope threaded through it all like gold stitched into rough cloth. Once you hear a whisper, you can't unhear it. You carry it, even in silence. Days blurred into nights, and Pandora found herself drawn back to the box, not to open it again, but to listen. Hope spoke differently than the others. It wasn't loud like grief or sharp like hunger. It was the breath between words, the pause before laughter, the ember that refused to die even when the fire had gone black. Sometimes she wondered if the gods had meant to trap hope as a joke, or if even they were afraid of how powerful it might become once free. One evening, she dreamed with her eyes open. She saw her children, not yet born, standing in a time she could not name. They held tools she did not recognize, spoke words she couldn't follow, but still she felt the thread, the same whisper weaving through their lives. The thought startled her, but not with fear, with awe. She began to speak to the box openly. "Will they forgive me?" she asked once, her voice cracking, "for what I've let loose?" The reply was not words but warmth, a reassurance that forgiveness was the wrong question. What mattered was endurance. What mattered was that humans could keep walking, even under weight. Epimetheus noticed her murmuring and frowned. "Talking to yourself," she answered lightly. "Better than talking to gods who never answer." He shook his head and returned to his bread. But the truth was, she no longer felt alone in the silence. One night a storm rolled over the valley. Thunder clawed at the hills, and rain hammered the roof until it nearly split. Pandora sat by the box, every flash of lightning painting it gold. She half expected Zeus himself to stride in, furious, demanding she account for what she had done. But no one came. The gods did not care enough to undo her act, and that, oddly, was liberating. She whispered into the storm. "Then it's ours now. Isn't it the pain, the hunger, the hope?" And hope pulsed back, steady as her own heartbeat. In that moment, she understood what the gods had never wanted her to know. Humanity was not a game piece. They were not meant to be locked in innocence like livestock in a pen. They were meant to stumble, to bleed, to build again. guided not by orders from Olympus but by the fragile, stubborn light that hope carried. When the storm finally passed, she stood taller. The box rested quiet, content. Epimetheus slept through it all, unmoved. But Pandora felt awake in a way she never had before. The house smelled of wet earth and smoke, and in it she found no terror, only a beginning. She laid a hand on the bronze one last time that night and whispered, "I will keep listening." And somewhere in the dark, the whisper returned, promising it would never leave her. Down in the lower fields, a boy named Alexios rose before dawn, his stomach already aching from hunger. His father had died 2 summers ago, and his mother spent her days weaving until her hands cracked, trying to barter cloth for grain. Alexios had become the runner carrying bread, water, whatever they could spare to the oracle Cleo at the edge of the valley. People still called her Pythia, though her temple had crumbled long before he was born. They said she was gifted with visions. Alexios wasn't sure. He only knew she looked like a bundle of bones wrapped in smoke, and if someone didn't bring her food, she would be gone. This morning he carried half a loaf, the crust blackened, but still warm. The path was wet from the storm that had torn the sky the night before. His bare feet slipped in the mud, but he kept running. He didn't believe the gods would punish him for being late, but he knew hunger punished quicker than lightning. Cleo sat against the broken stones, her hair tangled, her eyes bright with something beyond fever. She reached for the bread with shaking fingers. Alexios handed it over, not bowing, not praying. He only said, "Eat." She did, tearing it slow, chewing as if each bite was a battle. When she finished, she leaned close, her breath sour but her voice steady. "They ask me for prophecies," she whispered, nodding toward the villagers who still came with offerings. "They want to hear the future, but I give them what I see." Alexios frowned. "And what do you see?" Cleo smiled, thin and sharp. "Mostly my own hunger. Sometimes the crack in a roof beam. Sometimes the look in a mother's eyes when she knows her son will not return from war. They call that prophecy. It is only noticing. The truth doesn't need divine thunder. Sometimes it's just someone honest enough to say what's already in front of you." Alexios sat with her, the bread gone between them. He thought of the box stories, the whispers of grief and war already roaming the land. Maybe people wanted magic to make sense of the chaos, but Cleo's words landed heavier than lightning. Maybe prophecy wasn't a gift from the gods. Maybe it was a hunger sharpened into clarity. The villagers came and went, kneeling, begging for signs. Cleo told one man to fix his roof before the rains returned. She told a woman to speak gently to her daughter, or the girl would leave. To another, she said nothing, just looked at his hands scarred from war until he lowered his head and walked away. Alexios watched their faces change: disappointment, relief, anger, but always something shifted. These weren't visions from smoke or incense. These were truths they had ignored until someone named them. He realized that bringing her bread was not feeding prophecy. It was keeping honesty alive. As the sun lowered, Cleo pressed a crumb back into Alexios's hand. "Take this home," she said. "Tell your mother I saw her weaving. The thread will hold." He stared at her. "You saw that?" She smiled again. "No, I just know her hands. That's enough." Walking back through the valley, Alexios felt taller. The loaf was gone, but something heavier filled his chest. Not faith in gods, not fear of curses, but the strange relief of seeing that wisdom could be as simple as attention. The box may have unleashed chaos, but hope whispered in unlikely places in a starving woman's blunt honesty, in the small act of a boy who refused to let her starve. That night, when he lay on the floor beside his mother, he repeated Cleo's words quietly. "It is only noticing." And though his stomach still growled, he fell asleep faster than he had in months, as if hope had curled up beside him, patient and awake. In the port city, a girl was testing something no priest would bless. Mira was 12, quick with her eyes. She haunted the docks where crews scraped salt from their nets and flicked the white crust back into the sea. Waste made her itchy. Her mother mended sails in a lane so narrow the sun arrived late, their wall, patched and repatched, always turned to chalk after winter rains. People blamed anything but the recipe. Mira blamed the mix. She saved a clay cup of dried salt and hid it under the bench. When the wall cracked again, a thin, mean line from floor to shutter. She waited until her mother slept and worked by lamplight. She ground the salt with the bottom of a bowl, mixed a small batch of lime and sand, and stirred until the lumps gave up. The slurry burned her hands. Some experiments start with thunder. The useful ones start with a kid and a mess. She pressed the mortar into the crack and smoothed it with a damp cloth. The wall changed under her fingers, less flour, more stone. She watched it set. The patch stayed put. In the morning, her mother noticed the tidy scar and the red burns. "What did you touch the wall?" Mira said. "Don't touch lime with bare skin." Little owl. Her mother smeared goat fat on the burns and kissed her hair. Leave walls to men who charge too much. The city pretended not to notice children unless they were in the way. Mira learned to be useful enough to be ignored. She carried water, fetched nails, and listened. She asked why plaster failed in rain, and walls slumped while harbour steps held. She made more patches small, hidden each with a pinch of salt. She kept notes, ratios, and weather. After the first storm, the salted seams held while older joints loosened into white skirts. She did not brag. She circled each patch with charcoal and waited. The second storm came hard off the sea. Mira walked her circles. The salted seams thinned but did not open. The others curled like old parchment. She let herself feel the spark she had been stamping down. This might actually matter. She told the plasterer. He laughed. Took her coin, used his usual mix. His repairs washed out before the week ended. She went back to the nets. There are kinds of knowledge you can sell and kinds you have to give away or they rot. She chose giving. She asked kids on her lane to bring cups of rope salt. She turned the courtyard into a workshop and showed them how to grind, mix, and test a small patch at ankle height before touching higher cracks. Rules: clean the dust, dampen the surface, press, smooth, wait. No ladders without an adult. By summer, the lane wore a dozen circles. People joked about the children's game. Then they ran their fingers across the patches after a storm, and the jokes dried up. Mira's mother sewed a pouch for her notes and told her to tuck it under her dress. Not because the notes were secret, but because men liked to take credit for things that weren't theirs. A councilman came. His tunic had never seen salt. He tapped a wall with his ring and called the idea folk nonsense. Someone smeared mud over the circles. In the morning, Mira's friend stood with fists balled and eyes bright. She handed them rags and water. "We don't fight mud with shouting," she said. "We wipe and we build. Every new thing meets a wall. That's how you know you're pushing." Word travelled through women who kept households standing and sailors who cared more about boats that didn't leak than about credit. The hillside mason read her notes and called her colleague. He tested the mix on a retaining wall that always slumped in autumn. When it didn't slump, he told 2 masons. They told 5. A month later, Mira stood before a half-circle of officials. She set a broken tile, a cup of ground salt, and a sample mix that cured while they questioned her. Would salt ruin lime? The proof is on the street. Who taught you the sea? Why trust a child? Storms don't check birth dates before tearing roofs off. They mulled payment, Mira said. Sell the blend to everyone at the same price. A policy, not a patent. If the council sold the mix cheap, the city would last longer. If the city lasted, the people who sneered would forget her name. The walls would remember. The city printed a notice and set a stall by the cistern. Holmes bought a scoop for a loaf. Sailors left jars of rope salt for a bronze pin. Late autumn brought a storm that should have done real damage. It didn't. Lanes flooded and dried. Houses stood. The harbour steps held their line. Mira walked her route and found her oldest circle still there, stubborn as a healed scar. She pressed her palm to it and felt the grit of salt like a heartbeat under stone. Mira breathed. Finally, without bracing for collapse tonight, her mother came out with warm bread and a tired smile. "So," she asked, "was it the gods?" "No," Mira said, handing her half, just noticing, and refusing to waste what the sea keeps giving back. The city never carved her name into a column. It didn't matter. The next winter the walls held again. People slept through storms. Children fell asleep to the sound of the rain and woke in the same beds. Hope, it turned out, wasn't a banner. It was seams that didn't open when the wind leaned hard. It was a girl with burned hands who taught other kids to mix and smooth and wait. And the lane that once crumbled became the lane people walked when they wanted to remember how a city should sound in heavy weather, quiet, solid, water going where it's supposed to. Damon was 8, and no one in the city wanted him underfoot. His mother swept the temple steps. His father had died hauling marble blocks to the Acropolis, crushed under the weight of stone meant for gods. Damon didn't remember his father's face. Only the rope burns on his own palms from tugging at loads too heavy for a boy. Most days, he lingered near the builders, weaving through legs and shouting questions until someone cuffed him away. He learned the taste of dust, the groan of pulleys, the hiss of ropes dragged too fast. He learned what silence meant, too silent when a block shifted wrong, when men froze because they knew something had gone off. One noon the air was bright and hard. A marble drum swung in the air, meant for the Parthenon's roof. The ropes creaked like old knees. Damon saw it first, a cord fraying above the pulley, fibres peeling like threads on his mother's apron. He shouted, "The rope!" Look at the rope, but the men ignored him. He was always shouting. The drum swayed higher. The rope screamed. Damon grabbed a length of discarded cord, tied it clumsily around his waist, and scrambled up the scaffold. The wood burned his feet. He reached the pulley, jammed the spare cord in place, and pulled with everything he had. The rope snapped. The marble jerked, dipped, then caught. The spare cord held long enough for the men below to seize the weight and lash it down. Dust exploded, men cursed, scrambled, then looked up. Damon clung to the beam, chest heaving, splinters in his arms. The foreman climbed up, his face red. For a moment, Damon thought he'd be thrown down. Instead, the man grabbed him by the neck, not gently, and barked, "You should have been killed." Then softer, "But you weren't. You saved it." He shoved Damon toward the ladder. Stay out of the way or stay useful. Sometimes the only thing separating disaster from legend is the kid no one listens to. Word spread by evening. Not his name, kids' names didn't travel, but the story of a boy who tied a rope where grown men hadn't noticed. Some scoffed, calling it luck. Others muttered that maybe the gods spoke through children when adults were too busy arguing about wages. Damon's mother heard it all. She scrubbed her steps harder, shoulders tight. That night she told him, "Don't climb again. They'll blame you if you fall, or if you succeed too often." He nodded, but inside his chest a fire crackled. He returned the next day anyway. This time the builders shoved him toward the water jars, told him to fetch and carry. He did, but his eyes never left the ropes. Every squeak, every sag. He memorized. He carried more than water. He carried attention. Weeks later another rope frayed. This time the men caught it. The foreman's eyes flicked toward Damon just once. No words. But he kept letting the boy return. Damon never carved marble. He never drew a wage. But on nights when the wind carried the creak of wood and rope through the city, he lay on his mat and felt pride heavier than sleep. The temple would rise, the drums would hold, and somewhere between the stone and the sky, his hands had mattered. Hope wasn't always a prophecy or a cure. Sometimes it was a rope tied fast by a child no one thought to trust, holding long enough for others to catch on. He dreamed of running. The chain on his ankle clinked, but in the dream it didn't hold him. The field opened wide, wheat bending, sky clear. He ran faster than the dogs, faster than the whip. When he woke, sweat salted his lips, and the chain was still there. The man's name was Cleon, though no one called him that anymore. Slave, boy. Hands, those were the names that stuck. His back bore scars like rivers. His mind carried maps no one could take. The dream had been repeating for weeks, whispering the same thing each night: go north. The river bends. There's a grove. He told no one, not even the woman who sometimes shared her crust of bread with him. Dreams could get you killed quicker than hunger. But the voice inside the dream was different. It wasn't like memory or fear. It was calm, patient, like someone lighting a torch in a cave. Hope spoke softly, but it spoke. One night he decided silence was worse than risk. He tested the lock with a nail he'd hidden under his mat. It scraped, it caught, it gave. He froze, waiting for a shout. Nothing. He slipped the chain loose. The barracks breathed around him, men too tired to stir. He crept past the fence, the mud sucking at his feet. The dog stirred, but the wind shifted, carrying the smell of roasting meat from the main house. He moved. The road opened before him, pale in moonlight. He wanted to run, but forced himself to walk. each step measured as the dream had told him. At dawn, his legs shook, his throat burned, but there it was, the bend of the river, the grove of olives, just as the dream promised. He stumbled under the branches and laughed, though it came out cracked. For the first time in years, he let himself believe the chain was gone. Sometimes freedom starts not with a gate broken, but with a whisper saying it's even possible. For 3 days he hid there, drinking from the river, eating berries, shaking at every sound. The dream returned each night, steady as before. Keep walking. There's more. He wanted to obey, but fear tied him tighter than the chain had. On the 4th day, men came with spears. He saw them first, their armor flashing through trees. He could have run, but he knew the grove wouldn't protect him. He stepped out, bare hands raised. The leader sneered. Another runaway. They never last. Cleon thought of the dream, of hope whispering. He straightened. Maybe not me, he said, but someone will. They bound him, dragged him back. The whip sang again, cruel and eager. His body bent. His voice did not. Even as he bled, he told the others in the barracks north, River Bend, Grove. Remember. Some shook their heads. Some closed their eyes. But one boy listened. The map tucked itself into his memory. Cleon died before the month ended. The chain reclaimed his ankle, but not his story. The boy carried it. Years later, another chain would break in another night, and a figure would walk north, to the river bend, to the grove. Hope did not rescue Cleon, but it had spoken through him, stubborn enough to outlive a body. That whisper was stronger than iron. It moved from mouth to ear, dream to dream, until one day the grove sheltered someone long enough to keep walking. And that was enough. The vase shattered on the dock, and everyone went silent. It had been part of a shipment meant for trade, fine Athenian pottery. Red figures painted with scenes of gods who never bothered to look down. The merchant cursed, bent to kick the shards into the sea. But an old woman stopped him. She crouched, fingers shaking, and lifted a piece. The curve of the clay caught the light, the painted eye of a warrior staring back. "Don't waste it," she said. "Even broken. It can carry something." The crowd laughed, but she carried the shards home. That night she fitted them together not into a vase, but into a jar patched with resin. It leaked at first, then less. By the week's end it held oil. Word spread. Sailors saw it and asked for patched jars to carry brine or olives. Broken pottery became trade instead of trash. The dock shifted. Where once shards cut bare feet, now they filled baskets bound for distant ports. Sometimes peace doesn't start with treaties. It starts with someone refusing to throw away what still has use. The city had been locked in feuds, neighbours glaring across alleys, merchants accusing one another of cheating scales. But patched jars became common ground. One man sold oil in a vessel that wore 3 different makers' marks, each from rival workshops. Another carried grain in a jar patched with the clay of 2 warring villages. Buyers cared less about who had made it, and more about the fact that it held. Soon the dock sounded different, less shouting, more haggling. A truce built out of clay and resin. No council decreed it. No priest blessed it. People simply realized survival was easier when nothing went to waste. Children scavenged shards, turning the hunt into a game. Women traded recipes for resin stronger than pitch. Even soldiers began carrying patched flasks on long marches. They muttered that it was bad luck to drink from a jar that had been shattered, but thirst spoke louder than superstition. One evening 2 men from rival villages met by chance on the quay. They recognized each other's marks on a jar patched together, half his clay, half mine. For a long moment they stared, then one laughed. "So we've been feeding each other all along." That laugh cracked more than the jar had. The feud cooled, not because of forgiveness, but because the absurdity was too plain to ignore. Merchants carried the story inland. A general heard it and remarked that patched jars lasted longer on campaign than new ones. He told his men, "Use what's given, mend what breaks." Soldiers grumbled less when they drank from clay that bore the scars of old fights. The old woman who had picked up the first shard sat on her step, watching jars she had patched pass by. No one remembered her name. They remembered only that broken things could carry weight again. Hope didn't arrive as a speech or a miracle. It arrived as a jar that should have been useless. doing its job anyway. And for the first time in years, the dockside slept without knives drawn. The boy who carried patched jars inland grew into a young man who carried questions instead. His name was Theron, though in the marketplace he was called the Scribbler, because he filled scraps of wax tablets with lines of thought instead of keeping accounts. He studied the jars patched from rival clays and thought if people could drink from contradictions without dying, maybe they could think them too. He wrote late into the night, by lamplight too dim for comfort. The essay he shaped was blunt, dangerous. The gods are not keepers of hope. Hope belongs to humans. It grows where we choose to notice each other. He described Pandora not as a fool, but as the first to realize ignorance is not safety. He argued that Zeus feared hope, because it was the one force Olympus couldn't leash. Words on a page can be more dangerous than any sword because they don't need arms to spread, only eyes willing to look. Theron read his essay aloud once, to a handful of friends in a wine shop. The room went still. One man crossed himself in old habit, as if warding off a curse. Another laughed too loud, hoping the noise would drown the meaning. A woman leaned forward, eyes bright, and whispered, "Write more." But someone else carried the words to the wrong ears. Soldiers arrived the next morning, seizing the wax tablets, dragging Theron to the steps of the magistrate. The charge was clear blasphemy, sedition, arrogance against Zeus. He stood barefoot before men in polished cloaks, his essay read aloud like a crime. He expected to feel terror. Instead, he felt clarity. If the gods feared words, then words were already winning. The verdict was exile, not death. Perhaps they thought a boy with ink-stained fingers wasn't worth blood. They cast him out, his possessions stripped, his notes burned. But scraps survived phrases memorized by the woman from the wine shop, a line copied onto pottery by a merchant who liked the sound. Hope belongs to humans. The sentence clung. Impossible to kill. Theron walked the roads, stomach hollow, sandals torn, yet everywhere he went, he found his own words waiting for him, spoken by strangers who didn't know the source. A mason muttered them while mixing mortar. A soldier carved them into the handle of a spear. A mother told her daughter as comfort before sleep. The essay lived without him. One night, huddled by a fire of olive branches, Theron realized exile was not defeat, it was distribution. The city could silence a man, but not the echo of a truth people already half believed. Hope didn't need Olympus. It needed voices willing to risk being called foolish, blasphemous, or naive. Voices that turned hunger and exile into proof that survival was possible. Theron smiled into the smoke. He had nothing, yet his words had already slipped beyond reach. And maybe that was the point. Ideas aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to move, like patched jars carried from one hand to another, stronger for every crack. Theseus walked into the labyrinth with his jaw set like stone, sword in hand, glory already written in his stride. The air stank of damp earth and old fear. He imagined songs that would crown him savior. The beast's head raised high above Athens. But when he found the Minotaur, the monster was not charging, not roaring. It was sitting against the wall, its massive chest heaving like any tired man's. The two locked eyes. The Minotaur did not move. Its horns gleamed in the torchlight, but its hands rested open on its knees. Theseus raised his sword, but a voice, rough as gravel, filled the tunnel. "Do you ever ask who built the cage?" Theseus froze. "You're a monster." The creature snorted. "That's what they told you." "What did they tell me? That I was shame-wrapped in skin?" "They left me here to rot, and they needed someone like you to make it heroic." The silence stretched. Theseus gripped the hilt tighter, but his arm trembled. He saw scars on the Minotaur's wrists, gouges in the stone where the beast had tried, years ago, to claw its way out. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the enemy you came to kill, it's realizing you were sent to finish a story that was never true. The Minotaur leaned forward. "Do you think killing me frees Athens, or does it just make another song to flatter a king?" Theseus's chest burned. The torch shook in his hand. For a moment he wondered what would happen if he lowered the blade, if he led the creature out instead of striking. But the thread Ariadne had given him tugged at his wrist. The people waiting above demanded blood, not questions. The Minotaur smiled without joy. "Go on, then. Make your myth. Just remember who built the walls you're standing in. Monsters don't design labyrinths. Men do. The sword fell. The beast crumpled, not roaring but sighing, as though finally released from waiting. Blood slicked the floor. Theseus stood over the body, sick with victory. When he emerged from the maze, cheers roared. The head was hoisted, garlands thrown, but inside him, the Minotaur's words gnawed louder than the applause. Later, alone. He admitted it, the labyrinth had not been a battle. It had been a stage, and he had played his role. Hope flickered not in his triumph, but in the small crack left by doubt, the chance that one day someone would question who the true monsters were and who the prisoners. The songs would call him hero. His silence would remember otherwise. Medusa's head stared from the sack at Perseus's side, eyes dulled but still dangerous enough to keep covered. The people cheered him as saviour, a slayer of monsters. But the story carried in their voices was not the one Medusa had tried to tell. Before the blade, before the ambush in her cave, she'd spoken low, careful, as if any listening ear might betray her words. I was not born this way, she had said. I was made. Their temple, their priest, their god when Poseidon claimed me. They punished me. They turned me into the warning, so no one would question the crime. Perseus had gripped his sword tighter, because to hear truth from the mouth of a monster was more dangerous than facing her gaze. The reflection in his shield trembled not from her curse, but from his own hesitation. The hardest part of killing isn't the strike. It's silencing the story your enemy is desperate to leave behind. When the blade fell, the cave went quiet, but the silence wasn't victory. It was theft. Her words stuck in him, as if they had been carved into his ribs. He carried the head to kings and cities, lifted it like proof of his courage, but inside he felt less hero and more thief. Medusa's sisters wailed that night, their cries carrying across the cliffs. People called it the howling of beasts. Perseus knew better. It was mourning, at banquets. He heard men repeat the tale how a cursed woman had preyed upon innocence, how Perseus had cut her down. Each retelling polished the lie. The truth that she was a victim punished for her own violation was scrubbed away like blood from marble floors. But memory has a way of leaking through cracks. Servants whispered. Fishermen spoke of a girl once kind, once radiant, who had been wronged by a god. Children asked why a monster would weep before her death. Questions clung, even when answers were forbidden. Perseus never admitted it aloud, but he knew. He had seen the fear in her eyes, not of him, but of being forgotten. That, more than the sword, had cut deepest. Hope lingered not in the lie sung by poets, but in the stubborn persistence of her story. For every banquet tale, there was a whispered counter-story, a voice daring to say, maybe Medusa was never the monster. And Perseus, alone at night, could not silence her last words. They lived in him, proof that some truths survive even execution. The city burned, and the soldier could not hear his own breath over the roar of collapsing timber. He staggered through the smoke, spear lost, shield gone, clutching only a shard of pottery he had picked up without thinking. Around him, walls folded in, shrines crumbled, screams twisted into the crackle of fire. He had been told this was glory marching with banners high, fighting for honour. But all he saw were roofs collapsing on children and the ash of neighbours drifting like grey snow. His legs shook. He dug through the rubble anyway, hands bleeding, searching for a friend he had sworn to protect. Under the charred beam he found a body, not his friend, just another boy, mouth open in a scream that had never finished. He pressed his forehead against the stone and whispered, "Don't let me be the only one left." The words weren't a prayer to the gods. He had stopped trusting them. They were a plea to the whisper that still lived inside him, the same one Pandora had loosed hope. Sometimes survival doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like the curse of being left to remember what was lost. He dragged 3 more men from the smoke, though none breathed. His arms trembled, his vision swam. Then, in the middle of the ruin, he heard a faint sound, a cough. He clawed through a mound of ash, ripped his nails down to flesh, and pulled free his friend, half buried, gasping, eyes wild. For a moment the fire didn't matter. For a moment he believed. They stumbled toward the river, collapsing on the bank. The water stung like acid on their wounds. but it was life. The soldier laughed, a cracked, ragged sound, as if daring the world to take that too. Days later, the army marched on, leaving the city in ruins. The soldier followed, body alive but mind scorched. He spoke less, ate little, woke screaming. His friend laid a hand on his shoulder, but touch couldn't mend what burned inside. He carried the fire with him. At night he heard voices in the smoke of his dreams, the cries of the lost, the laughter of flames. Yet hope's whisper threaded through even that darkness. Stand. Keep walking. Breathe. He woke each morning with ash still in his throat but breath in his chest. He was not whole. He would never be whole. But he had seen that, even in the ruins, a single cough could be enough to make digging worth it. That knowledge, heavy and terrible, was what he carried forward. The gods would call it survival. He called it endurance, hope, stubborn as embers in wet wood. Refused to go out, and so did he. The city was still smouldering when he finally closed his eyes, and even then the orange glow pressed against his lids like a hand that wouldn't let go. He had marched through smoke until the inside of his throat felt scraped raw. He had lifted beams with men whose names he would never learn, and he had found one friend, only one still breathing under the black ribs of a collapsed roof. He had given up his water for that friend and then laughed because the river had been 3 streets away the whole time, laughing the way a man laughs when he's too tired to cry. His name didn't matter to the officers, but his mother had called him Iason, and somewhere under the ash he tried to keep that name alive. He lay by the bank with his friend's head against his arm and listened to the hiss of wet wood turning to steam. Across the water someone was singing, not a hymn, just a human sound too stubborn to stop. When morning came, the army moved. Fires still crawled in the bones of houses. Dogs padded through alleys with their ears flat. The commander barked orders in a voice that pretended none of it mattered. "Forward," he shouted, as if the road were a straight line drawn on a map and not a trail bordered by graves. Iason stood because bodies that refuse to stand are the first to get kicked. He walked with the column, sandals chewing his heels, and counted the things he had seen that no story would keep a woman who kept brushing ash from her child's hair as if the child were only sleeping. A boy who handed him a patch jar with both hands and said, "Drink," as if generosity could be a wall. The jar held. The water tasted of clay and salt and something like courage. He carried it for a mile before handing it back and watching the boy's small shape fold into the ruins. Glory never looks like it does on the painted vases. Up close, it has a smell, and it isn't laurel. On the second day, the army reached the road out, a vein carved through fields where the grain had melted to glass. Refugees walked the same way, eyes empty, feet cracked and bleeding, carrying what they could balance on backs and hips and hope. Iason wanted to step out of formation and give them the bread he had hidden in his cloak, but the man beside him, Nico, the friend he had dragged from the fire, tipped his chin toward the commander. "He'll take it and make a speech," Nico said. "Wait for dusk." So Iason did. In the blue hour he slipped from the line, wrapped half his loaf in a strip of his own tunic, and tucked it into a little girl's hands as she slept by a cart. He never told Nico. The next morning the cart was gone, and he let himself believe that meant she had moved on, walking, eating, one mouthful at a time. Sleep, when it came like a door that wouldn't shut. He watched the fire in his mind replay itself in smaller and smaller loops, until each crack of timber became a heartbeat, and each heartbeat threatened to stop. When he did sleep, he woke choking, his hands clawing at ashes that weren't there. Nico learned to roll to face him quietly, a hand on Iason's forearm in the dark. "Breathe," Nico would say, as if breath were a skill you could teach. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes Iason stood and stared at the sky until the shape of the constellations felt like a map out of his head. The army needed bodies more than discipline, so no one punished him for failing to laugh at jokes or for keeping his spear too clean. They did not want to look at him because his face reminded them of where they had been. That was its own kind of mercy. He learned to live in the corner of their vision. The next city on the commander's slate was a low-walled town by a river bend, a market for figs and wool. "We march at night and take it at dawn," the commander said, tapping the line as if tapping could make it easy. Iason thought of another river bend, one he had never seen but that had still saved a man named Cleon in a story passed around campfires go north. The river bends. There's a grove. Cleon hadn't lived. the story said. But someone else had, carrying his map forward like a secret prayer. That's how hope travelled now, mouth to ear, breath to breath. On the last mile he fell in step with an older man whose sandals were stitched with patch after patch. The man carried reeds and a clay cup scarred with resin. "You patched that yourself?" Ison asked. "My wife," the man said. "She says broken things know their job better the second time." Ison smiled without meaning to. She's right. Dawn didn't matter to the town. It woke to shouting and iron anyway. Gates groaned. Arrows hissed. Somewhere a goat bleated as if it had an opinion on war. Ison moved because the line moved, not because his head wanted to. He kept his eyes on Nico's shoulders and put his boots in the prints his friend left. Inside the walls. People ran like water looking for a low place to settle. He ducked into a narrow lane to avoid a falling basket and stumbled into a courtyard where jars of oil stood in ranks, like quiet soldiers. A torch clattered to the ground at his feet, a wild lick of flames searching for purpose. Ison stared at it, and then at the jars, and imagined the courtyard exploding into a small sun. He imagined children in the next room going quiet all at once. His hand moved before his orders did. He kicked the torch into a puddle. It sizzled and died. He poured water from a patched jar over the nearest amphora's base where oil had slopped in the rush, muttering to himself low and fierce, "Not this! Not this!" A captain rounded the corner and saw him crouched, wet and useless. "What are you doing?" "Keeping the fire where it belongs," Ison said, not looking up. "We burn supplies," the captain snapped. "They're ours once we're inside," Ison answered, and when the captain raised his hand for a slap, Ison stood and met his gaze. The hand lowered. The captain spit near his sandal and stalked off to find an easier argument. By noon, the town was quiet under a new noise sorting, counting, carrying the work of people who call themselves victors because a ledger says so. Ison found Nico sitting on a step, rubbing his shoulder. "You ever think the gods watch any of this?" Nico asked, not really expecting an answer. "No," Ison said, "but people do, and we decide what to remember." "What do you want to remember?" "That I didn't light the torch that time," Ison said. He waited for shame and felt something else, a weight that wasn't regret. That someone gave me water in a ruined street. That we said the names of 3 people before we slept. They made a practice of it after that. Each night, they said the names of the day's dead if they knew them, or described a face if they didn't a way of telling the dark it could not take everything without being seen. Sometimes they ran out of names and sat silent with their palms up, as if to catch rain. The commander noticed none of this. He noticed that Ison lifted, carried, fetched, and did not complain. The next week he reassigned him from spearline to logistics. "You like counting and keeping things dry?" the commander asked, as if giving a compliment by accident. "Fine. Make sure the oil moves and the grain doesn't rot." The work suited the part of Ison's mind that still liked order. He patched jars, learned to pick resin that wouldn't sour oil, learned which roads drained after rain and which turned to lakes. He asked old women how they kept bread from moulding in summer. He watched potters flip amphora to listen for hairline cracks, the way a physician listens for a cough. One afternoon he met a man with ink on his fingers and a pale circle where a ring had been. "You look like you know why things fall apart," the man said mildly. "I only know they do," Ison answered. "Sometimes we can make them fall apart slower." The man smiled. "Theron," he said, as if the name needed apology. "I write things that get me sent away." "Do you have water?" Ison handed him a cup. Theron drank and sighed. "Hope doesn't belong to the gods," he said, as if finishing a conversation Ison had started in his own head. "It grows where people notice each other. I wrote that once. Men in bright clothes were not delighted." "I've heard it," Ison said. Startled, a mason carved it into a door lintel 2 towns back. "Good," Theron said. "Stone has a way of surviving speeches." They walked together for a mile, talking about jars and law and how a sentence can outlive its writer. When they parted, Theron pressed a scrap of wax into Ison's hand. "Names are threads," it read. "If you can't save the cloth, save the thread." Ison tucked it into the seam of his tunic and felt steadier for the weight. If heroism is just you being loud, it won't last. If it can be copied quietly, it will. A storage tent caught fire with no enemy near fire, simply doing what fire does when men stack oil and straw together and turn their backs. Ison saw the smoke and shouted before thought. He formed a line with whoever was close cooks, a knife sharpener, a soldier with one good arm, and they passed jars hand to hand away from the heat. He watched for the look that means someone is about to drop a weight he can't confess, and when he saw it, he stepped into the space and took the next jar. The tent blackened, smoked, and went out. Boring. Blessed boring. That night Nico fell asleep with his forehead on his forearm. Eason lay awake and listened to the camp breathe. A fox barked beyond the circle of light. He thought of the burning city and understood he would never not think of it. He also understood that memory could be work instead of a wound if he picked it up with both hands. The next morning he found the knife sharpener and taught him the jar line. "If you smell pitch and hear the canvas pop," Eason said, "don't wait for shouting. Find 9 people. Make a path. Keep your hands moving even when your mouth can't." The boy nodded, serious as a priest. Weeks blurred. The war changed shape the way wars do when they forget their purpose and continue by habit, on a road where figs grew wild. Eason and Nico walked at the end of the column. Nico gestured with his chin at a black stump that had sent up a single green shoot. "Look," he said, "this place refuses to die." "That's the only thing I believe in," Eason said softly. 2 weeks later, the commander ordered a lesson, his favourite word for punishment disguised as wisdom. A village had been slow with tribute. "Torch the granary," he said. Eason felt the command land like a sickness. Men straightened into the kind of obedience that always ruins someone else's day. He stepped into the granary doorway. "Not this one," he told the squad with the oil. The sergeant snorted. "You think you can hold a door with kindness?" "I think I can hold it because the hinges are bad and I'm heavy," Eason said. "And because if we burn this, we haul grain from farther away. Our bread goes stale. The road to the next town is mud. If you want to punish them, take their wagons." He said it like a quartermaster, not a priest. Faith sounds like numbers when you want soldiers to listen. The sergeant scowled and shrugged. "Fine. Wagons. Not mercy, but less hunger." Eason stepped aside and let the men do something petty instead of something catastrophic. He knew the difference wasn't noble. It was useful. News of the almost fire reached the commander anyway, Eason reported to the tent, expecting lashes and getting a lecture about overstepping and not knowing your place. He nodded where he had to and watched a gnat bump the lamplight. When the speech ended, the commander waved him away. "Just keep the food moving," he said, as if that were the only important thing in the world. So he did. He kept the food moving. He kept jars patched and names spoken at night and foxes fed with the fat he couldn't store. He taught 3 more boys to listen for the canvas pop and the oil reek. He showed 2 women in a captured town how to cure resin so it wouldn't taint what it sealed. He kept walking. There are losses you can't put into columns. One morning Nico didn't wake. He hadn't been wounded. He had simply run out of sleep. Eason sat and held his friend's hand and watched the pulse at the throat slow and stop. He said Nico's name 3 times after the chest went still, and then once more for the road. He wrapped him in a cloak and carried him to a hill where the soil was soft. He dug until his palms blistered, and then kept digging because grief needs a job. He set a stone. He carved letters with his knife crooked, but true. That night he didn't speak any names because his throat wouldn't open. He lay back and found no stars, only the tent roof and the knowledge that a spark could take it. He waited for hatred and found a strange stillness. He could not afford to hate the world if he wanted to keep water from turning to steam. Hate wastes breath. At dawn he woke with something like a plan, or maybe a habit promoted to plan. He made a list of who knew the jar line, who could read numbers on a slate, who could feel a crack before it showed. He found the knife sharpener, the woman from the captured town, the sergeant who had chosen wagons over grain, and told them all the same thing. "If I'm not here, you still do the thing. You teach someone else. You make it boring. If it's boring, it survives." In the weeks that followed, he saw proof that boring keeps you alive. A tent caught and went out because a cook slapped it once with a wet cloak exactly where he'd been taught. A wagon rolled and did not tip because someone remembered to wedge the wheel before loading. A child didn't drown in a storm because the gutters had been scraped clear by a man who said why not when asked. None of this would make a poet's list. He liked it better that way. He saw Theron twice more. Once in a square where a magistrate read a speech and people pretended to listen. Theron leaned in the shade with a smile that said he liked the cool more than the words. Once by a kiln where a potter showed him a funerary vase, and Theron asked for one with a flaw on purpose, a crack bridged by gold. So we don't forget what's stronger than new, he said. Eason bought that flawed vase with a week's wages and set it beside a river with no name. His dream shifted. The fire stayed, but so did other things, the patched jar the boy had handed him, the green shoot on the black stump, Nico's stone. Hope didn't drown out the other sounds. It insisted on being audible alongside them, the way a second singer finds harmony whether you want it or not. On a late summer evening, the army passed a village where children learned their letters on a whitewashed wall. The teacher, a woman with hair braided like rope, drew lines and hooks and said the names aloud so small mouths could copy them. Eason stopped on the road and listened. He watched a boy write his mother's name with his tongue between his teeth. He thought of Theron's scrap, names are threads. If you can't save the cloth, save the thread. He had no pen, he had a knife. He knelt by a ditch and carved the alphabet into a plank the flood had left, each letter a little crooked, each crookedness a proof. He slid the plank under the wall in the dusk like an offering to whatever gods cared about spelling. The war thinned. Armies do that not because truths get sorted, but because bodies are finite and coin runs out and someone decides hunger is quieter on the road home. Eason found himself walking a smaller road with fewer men. He didn't ask whether this was victory. He knew better. He asked who still needed water and who still knew the jar line by heart. When he finally came within sight of the city he had left months before, he didn't go in. He stood on a hill and counted the chimneys and listened for the faint sound of a market, and understood that time had continued without his permission. He took Nico's scrap of cloak from his belt, tied it to an olive branch, and left it there not a banner, a marker, a place where he had once considered going and decided instead to keep walking. He followed the river, because rivers have always known where to go. In a bend he found a grove, of course he did, and sat with his back against a tree that had lived through more storms than any man he knew. He closed his eyes and let the chorus of insects fill the space where orders used to be. He put his palm on the ground and felt the tremor of a mole going about its business, and smiled because somewhere something small was doing its job without waiting for approval. When he opened his eyes, a little girl stood 3 paces away holding a patched cup. "Drink," she said, neither shy nor bold, just practical, the kind of human who has watched others need water and concluded that asking is faster than waiting. He drank. The water tasted of clay and river and a kind of humility he'd been trying to learn. "Thank you," he said, and gave it back. She tilted her head. "What happened to your hand?" she asked, pointing at the scars that had finally closed. "It remembered a fire," he said. "Does it still hurt sometimes?" he said. "But it knows what to do when it hears crackling." She nodded as if that were a lesson worth hiding in a pocket and ran toward voices. He watched her go and felt the small lift in the chest some call joy and others call relief. He never liked arguing for a word when both meant the same thing, the body choosing to keep moving. Evening put gold on the river. Someone downstream laughed. Someone upstream chopped wood. The grove held the weather like a memory and let it pass. Eason leaned his head against the bark and finally slept. Not because he had finished anything, but because he could set down the edge of his story and let hope carry the weight for a while. He dreamed not of flames, but of a line of people passing jars from hand to hand, quick and sure, the heat kept just out of reach. He dreamed of Theron's sentence carved on a city gate. He dreamed of Nico standing in a doorway with his sleeves rolled and a grin that said he'd already made the right kind of trouble. He dreamed of Pandora, a woman he had never met, lifting a lid and not damning the world, but telling it the truth about itself, that pain and courage come braided, that invention walks arm in arm with grief, that hope is not a cure, but a companion with good hands. He woke in the first blue of morning. The river moved. Olive leaves ticked in the breeze like small applause. He stood, stretched, and checked the path for loose stones. He adjusted the strap of a pack that held nothing important and everything he had saved, including the wax scrap with the line about names. He took one step, and then another, no oath, no anthem, no witness but the birds, and he did the most radical thing a soldier of a burning city can do. He kept walking. The first stones struck the shutters at dusk, flat thuds that sounded like someone knocking and then deciding against it. The Queen stood at the window anyway and watched the enemy camp bloom its little orange flowers one by one, firelight pricking holes in the dark around the city like a net being drawn tight. The river glinted and kept moving, because water doesn't keep other people's wars on its calendar. They had been ringed for 9 days. The first 2 were loud trumpets, insults flung from walls and field both, boys climbing battlements to shout bravery they would never need to prove. Now the city spoke in a whisper, sandals on stairs, grain measured to the handful, mothers dragging water jars in pairs so each arm would ache the same. Majesty, her steward said behind her, a man whose hair was the colour of almond bark. The council waits. She looked over her shoulder at the bed. Her son slept on his side, breath huffing like a bird. The fever had crept in quiet and stayed in a stubborn way she recognised in herself. The nurse glanced up, the question already in her eyes. The Queen nodded. If he wakes, cool cloths. If he shivers, more blankets. If he asks, tell him I'm in the garden. You don't have a garden anymore, the nurse said. Not unkindly. I know. The Queen straightened. That's why I have to go to the council. She was not a queen who wore her crown. You could tell when she stepped into the chamber. Men stared as if they'd been expecting a metal cue and were insulted by the absence of it. She let them stew. On the table a map smudged to the point of fiction, a jar of olives that hadn't been touched, a half-loaf that had been fingered to crumbs. The granaries. The magistrate began without bow. We judge we can last a week. You judged we could last a week 3 days ago, she said. Cut your estimate in half when you say it out loud. It wastes less hope. A younger man, one of those who admire bravery as long as it is someone else's, leaned forward. We have allies, he said. We hold the gates, we hold our pride, and our friends arrive. He said pride like it was something that fed children. Your allies are 6 days away, the steward said, tapping the map where dust had made a coastline of its own. The enemy is 6 hours from being bored enough to be cruel. The magistrate drew himself up. We do not bargain with men who camp on our doorstep. We bargain with whoever controls the price of bread, the Queen said. That has always been true, and you only hate it now because the price is a number you don't want to say. The argument had been the same for 3 nights. They wrapped it in fresh words and wore it out anyway. She let them talk until their voices frayed and then said, I will speak with their general at dawn. The chamber rustled in disapproval like a tree filled with birds that had all decided to be offended at the same time. You cannot, the magistrate began. I am not asking permission, she said. I am telling you our options have run out of cleverness. They dismissed her with the ceremony men choose when they want to pretend they still govern what they cannot change. She left by the back stairs, fingers trailing the cool plaster. In another life she had walked these halls thinking about festivals, tax ledgers, and the tiny thrill of a city waking on market day. Today she counted torches to make sure the night kept its promise to be visible. Her son moaned in sleep when she returned, a sound like a hinge. She pressed a cloth to his forehead and measured the heat with her lips the way mothers have always done, queens or not. In the corner sat the small chest that held the city seal, the one thing that could turn a suggestion into a decree. She opened it and let her fingers hover. It would be so easy to impress the wax with that stamp and call anything she wrote law. She closed the lid instead. The law mattered only to people inside a fence. The men outside did not bow to wax. At grey light she went to the wall. The enemy camp looked like any other camp she had seen from a road, smoke rising in predictable spirals, horses shifting their weight, the faint sound of laughter, because even soldiers laugh. A man in a red cloak rode forward under a white rag tied to a spear. He was not young and did not pretend to be. His beard curled like an argument. You are the Queen, he said, stopping just outside bow range. I had been told you would be more beautiful. I had been told you would be less honest, she said. Here we are, both improved. He smiled because men like it when you give them a line to hold. We can be done, he said. Open the gate, and I will hold my men. We will take grain, silver, and the men of your council as surety for peace. We will not burn houses. We will not break your wells. We will not touch your children. And in a year, she asked, when your tax doesn't feed your soldiers and you need another victory in your ledger. In a year, he said, you can send olives and wine like everyone else, and I will not remember your walls once stood against me. He might have believed that. Some men tell a lie so often they wear it like skin. But he had said the sentence about children without choking on it. She had met worse. Wait for my standard on the gate, she said. If you see it, ride. If you do not, wait for a different king to replace me with someone you prefer. Don't be dramatic, he said. I have burned dramatic cities. They taste like any other." The guard captain's jaw flexed when she told him what she was considering. "They'll call you traitor," he said. "They'll call me that anyway, later, when a new story needs a villain," she said. "I prefer the kind of betrayal that leaves more children alive." He walked with her along the parapet, both of them counting without speaking. How many archers still had dry bowstrings? How many men shivered because fever always finds a siege? He stopped by the postern gate, the small door built for emergencies and lies. "If there is a way to keep your promise without putting your name on it," he said, "I prefer that." She nodded. "So do I. History loves noise. Survival loves whispers." She gathered the handful of people she trusted because they were either too tired to lie or too practical to rehearse one. The baker who had baked through a famine and could make a loaf taste like a feast if you closed your eyes. The woman who kept lists for the temple and never forgot a number even when her own stomach counted days. The boy who had once patched a wall with salt when everyone else said walls were men's work. People who understood that doing something small very well can be a revolution. "Tonight we will open the postern to let the first 50 children out," she said. "They go with their mothers and grandmothers to the river path and into the olive grove. They wait there. If I raise the standard at dawn, the gate opens for the general, and we keep the men from going house to house. If I do not, the second 50 go, and then the third. And if neither," the baker asked, "if there is no standard and no second 50, then we are already a story being told by someone else," she said. "But we can choose what our last paragraph looks like." The nurse met her in the corridor with the bowl. "He drank," she said, and then low, "He asked if the noise outside is thunder." "Tell him yes," the queen said. "Thunder that hasn't learned manners." She sat by his bed until dusk thickened, telling him a story about a fox who stole grapes from a rich man and then took only the seed so there would be more grapes next year. He fell asleep while the fox was still choosing which row would make the fattest future. She left him there with the story in his ear because sometimes the only way to let a child sleep is to give them something with roots. At midnight, the city moved like a body in pain, careful, half-bent, determined. The captain unlocked the postern and set his shoulder to the door so it would not betray them by squeaking. Women went first, wrapped in night, babies bound tight to keep their cries from telling the wrong story. The queen did not lead them. Her face would have been a torch. She stood just inside the door and counted hair, fingers, the way mothers count. 50 is a small number until you have to put it through a hole, while men with torches stand a yard away. The line went out and out again until the first part of her plan had a pulse. The second part would require something worse than stealth. It would require theatre. At pre-dawn she climbed the north tower where the standard waited. The wind off the river was not cold, but it lifted her hair and made the night smell like iron. The general's camp was a row of patient embers. Patience was the most dangerous thing a besieger could have. She set her hand on the pole. Not yet. She went down the stairs and through the hall where the magistrate and his friends had fallen asleep with their mouths open, wine turning their breaths to a single sour cloud. She took the city seal from its box, pressed it to wax, and wrote a letter in the smallest hand she could hold together with her exhaustion. "General, open your ears and close your mouth. If your men enter at the main gate, they will break, because breaking is what groups of men do when given a door and the word victory. You will spend a week afterward dragging them from houses and hanging them by their heels to remind them of your orders. Or you can walk 20 men through the postern at the second bell and take only the grain houses, the money chests, and the council. The people will not scatter if they still have a place to sleep. You don't care about their sleep. I do. You care about your script. We captured a city. We paid the army. This is how you get it." She sealed it and sent a runner out the same hole the children had used, a boy whose bare feet made no more sound than a moth. Then she walked to the temple and knelt where the floor remembered knees. She did not ask the gods for anything. She told the room what she planned and sat with it until the plan felt like something heavier than nerves. At the second bell, the postern opened again. Not for women this time, but for men built like doors. They did not cheer when they entered. They did not sneer. They nodded to the captain because the nod had been bought hours ago by a detail no one would put in the story. The captain's wife had a son with a crooked foot, and the general had promised him a place-hauling wagon so someone else could call him useful. The men went where they were told. Grainhouse, treasury, council hall. They put their backs to doors and their hands on the shoulders of loud men, and walk them out into the pale beginning of morning. The city woke to the sight of their leaders being led, and there was no point in shouting. You cannot give a speech to a dawn. The standard went up. On the field, the general swung his horse with something like relief. The gates opened because they always open for whatever story looks like it will win. The army came in like a tide that had been asked, politely, to stay below the first step. They took what they had been promised to take and not what they would brag about later. Men went home angry, wives breathed. The roofs stayed roofs. The Queen walked to the council hall because it is better to go toward your humiliation than wait for it to come collect you. The magistrate spat at her feet. You sold us. No, she said. I paid your bill in advance. They will call you traitor in the songs, he said. They already wrote them, she said. The men who write songs hate paying for bread. I made sure there would be bread. The general approached with a face that tried to decide whether it respected her. You are efficient, he said. I enjoy efficient. You enjoy getting what you want without having to discipline your men, she said. We both win. He looked up at the standard, then at the quiet street. You bought a future with your reputation, he said. Was that worth it? Reputation is noise, she said. Future is sleep. He took the councillor's surety and promised out loud, for all ears, that the army would leave the wells, the roofs, and the children untouched. Promises spoken in morning have at least a chance of living to noon. By afternoon, the city looked wrong in the best way intact after invasion. People cried in kitchens because crying is safer when the walls are still standing. The chronicle was written a week later by a man who had been drunk the night of the postern and therefore had missed the only part worth writing down. He called her decision the betrayal of the gate. He used betrayal 3 times, because repetition is how you turn a thought into a groove for other thinkers to get stuck in. He left out the grove where the first 50 children had waited in the dark and then been led home with bread jammed into their hands by women who had not slept. He left out the boy with the crooked foot who carried water like a man with straight legs. He left out her son's fever breaking at dusk on the day the army left, sweat soaking the pillow until the linen gave up and lay flat. The city adjusted itself around the new shape like a body does around a scar. People went back to the market slowly, as if they were afraid to put weight on a healed ankle. The Queen was greeted in alleys with turned shoulders and in courtyards with quiet thanks. She did not penalise the first. She did not reward the second. She went to the granaries and the wells because those are the rooms where a city tells the truth about what it thinks is valuable. Her son ran in the courtyard 2 days later, thin legs a blur. He tripped and skinned his knee and cried, then laughed because he had remembered how. Did we win, he asked, as if winning were an answer you could put on a plate. We're eating dinner in our own house, she said. That's what we won. He grew better. The city grew quieter. The magistrate's friends practiced their outrage again in public, because outrage returns as reliably as starlings. Someone painted traitor on the palace door. The Queen read the word and did not sand it down. She liked that truth sits better beside an accusation. Let them share the same door. A year later, a drought cracked the hills. The river whispered instead of sang. The same general sent men to collect adjusted tribute. He arrived at the gate not on a horse but on a memory, expecting the city to open like a mouth. The captain, older, greyer, with a son who walked better than he used to met them, and handed over olive oil tallies and grain that would not rot on the road. Use what's given, the captain said, not because he quoted anyone, but because phrases born in practicality have a way of sounding like proverbs. The general took the tribute and said to the captain, Your Queen betrayed you and saved you. That is a difficult thing to carry. It is lighter than the alternative, the captain said, and shut the gate. Not everyone forgives a bruise just because the bone didn't break. A faction grew men who wanted the old story back where their dignity had a simple outline. They found a poet to grind their feeling into couplets. He obliged. The song found its way into taverns and courtyards, and the spaces where people need to blame someone for their fear. The Queen did not outlaw it. She asked the baker what she thought. The song keeps me awake, the baker said. Flour on her forearms like new snow, so I get more bread out of the oven. That's the only way I know to answer a song. Rumours have their own weather. One morning, clouds gathered that had nothing to do with rain. The faction brought a rope and a law. They wanted her tried for treason. The council knew men. Same chairs summoned her to stand in the same room where she had once said the word postern like a prayer. She wore no crown. She wore a plain dress and a face that had not learned to apologize for doing arithmetic when others had chosen poetry. The magistrate read out the charges as if reading could make the story right. She listened the way you listen to a neighbour complain about a fence when the river is eating the road. When they offered her the chance to defend herself, she said, "I won't teach you how to call what I did good so you can keep your dignity. Name it what you must. Keep the word, I'll keep the roofs." They sentenced her to exile. They would have preferred something bloodier, but bloodstains and stains remind. Exile is a cleaner kind of cowardice. The council escorted her to the gate with a formality that tried to be kind and failed. Her son walked beside her, carrying a bundle made heavier by a boy's pride. "When can we come back?" he asked. "When the songs change," she said, and then thought, or when the loaf on the table matters more than the song biting it. They left at dawn because leaving always feels less like leaving if you do it while the night is still making its case. On the road, she found the same river that had watched wars and shrugged. They walked along it because water remembers where to go. In a bend, they passed an orchard that had once been a battlefield. The trees were young but stubborn, fruit held like fists loosening. They reached a town with a square whitewashed for letters. Children traced syllables with wet sponges. On the wall, in small letters at the bottom of a list, someone had written, "Hope belongs to humans." She touched the words the way you touch the name of someone you love, softly enough not to wear it out. They rented a room above a pottery. The woman who owned it had hands stained the colour of sunset. She showed the queen how she mended a broken jar with bronze staples driven through drilled holes. The seam made beautiful by refusing to pretend it hadn't been. It holds better. Afterward, the woman said. It remembers the crack and chooses anyway. The boy learned to carry wet clay without breathing too hard. He learned to listen for the pitch that meant a pot would flare and split in the kiln if you tried to rush it. The queen learned to sleep without bracing. People in this town did not care about her name. They cared about the way she balanced baskets and the way she could count change in her head without looking at the coins. That was a kindness she'd not expected, and it settled into her bones slowly the way heat does after a cold rain. Sometimes refugees from her city found their way to the shop. They came with rumours wrapped around their bodies like cloaks the drought had ended. The council had fallen. The baker had been voted to the council. The faction had split into arguments about who had started the faction. In more than one version, someone had painted over the word on the palace door and then someone else had painted it back. The queen listened as if listening could change any of it. It couldn't, but it honoured the mouths carrying the words. On an evening when the kiln's heat had made the whole room gentle, a boy with ink on his fingers came in with a jar full of poppy seeds. "For sleep," he said, not offering price. Only the thing itself. He set the jar down and looked at her the way people look when they are trying to decide whether a face matches a name they only know from other people's mouths. "My mother called you traitor," he said. "Not cruel, just practicing honesty. Then last winter the roof didn't fall. Both things can be true," she said. "The world is greedy with truths." He nodded. "I wrote an essay," he said. "They burned it. People say it anyway." "Good," she said, recognizing something she could not have named a line running through different stories, the kind that doesn't snap when you stop looking at it, make more sentences that can survive fire. Her son listened from the stairs, his jaw set in the way it does when a boy decides a shape for himself. When the boy with the ink left, he asked, "Why didn't you tell him the whole story? Because he will carry the part he needs," she said. "If I give him the rest, I spoil the weight." Years passed, because years are not picky about where they walk. The orchard grew generous. The general who had liked efficiency died of a fever with no poetry to it. A new man took his place, one who liked speeches. He tried to raise tribute and found himself having to listen to towns that had learned new habits, jar lines, wedges under wheels, words on walls. Men like that hate inherent incompetence. He lowered tribute to preserve his voice. The queen's son grew tall and learned to move clay with a gentleness that surprised him when he noticed it. He asked his mother one night by the oven glow, "Do they still sing the song? They'll sing it until someone writes a better tune," she said. "That's how songs work." "What's a better tune?" he asked. "One that lets people sleep," she said. He nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he wanted to. There came a day when a delegation from the Queen's City arrived, dusty and carefully polite. The baker and the captain had sent them. They said, "We need someone who remembers how not to be dramatic when the river is low." The captain wrote in a letter that smelled faintly of salt. "Come home if you like, or write back and tell us the dumbest thing we're about to do, and we will stop." She laughed when she read that and cried when she reached the line at the bottom a child's wobbly hand had added, "Thank you for roofs." She did not return. The road behind her was not a trap, it was simply a road. She wrote letters how to tally grain when hands were slick with sweat, how to set guards at wells when men were bored, how to talk to a general in the morning and a council at night and not make promises you can't measure. She put no seal on them. They held anyway. On the night before a new kiln firing, she walked to the orchard alone. The fruit shone dull as coins in moonlight. She sat under a tree and pressed her palm to the ground, counting the undernoises of a place that had decided, against good evidence, to keep living. She thought of a wall, a postern, a dawn. She thought of a word on a door, and how the door had still opened for women carrying sleeping children. She thought of her son's knee scar and his hand steady on a spinning wheel. She thought of a city that had learned to hold two truths at once, that she had betrayed them, and that betrayal had fed them. The air moved, and she heard a whisper not from gods, not from memory, but from the part of the world that has always wanted to talk a human out of despair. Names are threads, it suggested unoriginal and perfect. She said the names she had collected over years like a woman counting beads, the nurse, the captain's wife, the baker, her steward with almond bark hair, the boy who had held his breath while passing a torch into a bucket, the general who had liked efficiency, the writer with sentences that survived fires, the child with the poppy seeds, her own boy, his infant name and his taller one, the first 50, the second 50, the third who had not needed to walk because dawn had been enough. She stitched them together out loud, careless of who heard. The night didn't mind. When she stood, the orchard had drawn its own map in the dew dark where footsteps had been, silver where they hadn't. She walked the dark because it felt like a hymn, and went home because the kiln had a schedule and clay has a way of cracking if you keep it waiting. Many years later, after her hands had cooled and her hair had gone the colour of the steward's, a child asked her to tell a story. "Tell me about the queen who betrayed her city," the child said, because children love the taste of a word that might be forbidden. The old woman smiled. Which part, she asked. The cracked door, the bread. The garden that wasn't there. The part where she decides, the child said. That part is always the same, the woman said. She decides to be hated by people who will live longer because she is. She decides that songs don't keep you dry. She decides that rumours are louder than thank yous, and she does it anyway. Does she regret it, the child asked. Every time she hears the song, the woman said, and never when she hears rain on a roof. The child fell asleep with that sentence folded into her breathing. The old woman watched the slow rise and fall of her chest and thought, the future is just this, a room where a child can sleep, and a jar that doesn't leak, and a door you can close without apologizing to it. Someone will write a better song, or not. The roofs will decide how good the song is. At harvest. The orchard threw a festival because trees demand attention the way any provider does. People hung patched jars in the branches with candles inside. The jars glowed along their seams like scars you decide to call beautiful. No one mentioned the queen. A boy with ink on his fingers read a sentence off a wall very low, almost a whisper. A soldier with scars that had learned their lesson carried a sleeping child to a mat. The captain with the son who walked like a wedge danced once, and then sat down to breathe and looked perfectly happy to be tired from that. Under it all, the city hers. Others made the sound she had always wanted, most water in gutters going where it should. The labour of the ordinary, the mathematics of being spared. The last time someone called her traitor to her face, she was buying onions. The woman tried the word on her like a shawl. Traitor, the woman said, without heat. Thank you, the old woman said, paying with exact change. I prefer roofs. She carried the onions home, sliced them, cried the honest way, and made soup enough for 2 extra bowls. Someone knocked. She opened the door and handed 1 bowl to whoever had thought to knock that night. The door closed, the roof did not leak, the pot did not crack, the world spun on its bad ankle and did not fall. Hope did not put a crown back on her head. It didn't even correct the history. It did what it always does when it's trying to be taken seriously. It kept people fed, walked children through posterns, stitched names into stories, and refuse to be embarrassed that it is quieter than a song and louder than a lie. And if anyone asks what she saved, you can answer without telling her name. You can say beds, wells, letters on walls, a boy with a crooked foot who found a job because a general once owed his mother a promise, an orchard where a field once remembered blood. You can say the first 50, the second 50. You can say roofs. You can say, and this will be the most accurate line in any chronicle that tries, that she gave up the right to be called pure and took, in its place, the right for others to sleep. She grew small in the chair the way candles do thinner each night, but somehow warmer. Years had slipped their hand through Pandora's hair and turned it silver. The same years had taught the shutters when to sing in the wind and the sparrows when to steal crumbs from her table. The box sat where it always had, the bronze dulled to a deep, kind glow, like an ember with a long memory. When the light moved across the room, the lid caught it and sent it back as a thin thread that climbed the wall and vanished near the beams. She did not sleep much now. Sleep came like a cautious guest and left at the first noise, so she listened instead past the crickets, past her own breath to the hum that had once kept her awake with dread. It was different these days. Not an ache behind the eyes, but a presence in the bones. Hope no longer sounded trapped. It sounded busy. Old age doesn't quiet the world. It just turns up the sounds that matter. Neighbours came and went more than they used to. The boys who once ran past her door without seeing it had grown into men who tapped the frame and asked if she needed wood or oil. Women brought bread wrapped in cloth and stayed to talk. They set their baskets down and let their hands rest, the way hands do when they are with someone who won't rush them. Sometimes they came with questions. Sometimes they left with something else, something they hadn't known to ask for. People started leaving small things by the box. It hadn't been her idea. One afternoon, a girl with burned knuckles, Mira, the salt girl grown into a young woman, with the posture of someone who knows her work will last, laid a tiny lump of white at the corner of the lid. "For the seams that matter," she said simply. Pandora nodded and kept her tears to herself. The next day, a boy in a dust-streaked tunic daemon, rope-scarred and quick, placed a strand of frayed cord on top of the salt. A widow slid a shard of painted clay under the leg of the table so it wouldn't wobble. A merchant's apprentice tucked a scrap of wax with a line scratched into it. Hope belongs to humans beneath the box's lip. No one made a rule. It just happened. The lid stayed shut, but the box filled anyway. Pandora learned each token the way a mother knows the sound of each child's footstep. The salt felt like weather under the skin, honest and stubborn. The rope whispered of timing and hands that move when orders are slow. The shard remembered breaking and did not pretend otherwise. The scrap of wax warmed under her fingers and left the faintest scent of smoke, as if the words had been carried through fire and were proud of the trip. Strangers knocked. 2. Travellers who had heard things in markets and followed the thread as far as it would go. One told her about a boy who died in a barracks but left a map in another man's head. Another told her about a soldier who organised a line of jar passes instead of speeches and saved a city from its own carelessness. She never asked if the soldier had a name. Names mattered, but the work mattered more. When they finished their stories, they ate the bread she kept wrapped in cloth by the stove and left a seed or a coin or a bit of ribbon from a dress long outgrown. For the box, they said. Pandora never corrected them. It was for the room, for the table, for the air between us. The gods didn't visit. Of course they didn't. Gods are experts at grand beginnings and vanishing at clean-up. She didn't miss them. When the wind worried the door and blew it open, she didn't think of Zeus. She thought of mortar and hinges and hands. When thunder rolled over the hills, she set another pot to catch the drip and smiled because water, like the gods, always finds a way in. It was people who decided whether the floor rotted or the garden drank. Sometimes, late. She spoke out loud to the box, not with the desperation of that young woman who couldn't keep her hands from the lid, but with the easy tone of someone sharing a porch with a friend. "Do you remember?" she would ask. How loud grief was the first night the lid did not answer, but the room did. Grief was loud still, but it had learned to sit beside laughter without shoving it off the bench. A child came on a bright, windless morning, the kind of day when the air is clear enough to make you honest. She slipped past the woman at the door and stood with her chin barely level with the table. Her hair was a mess of braids and tangles, and her eyes were sharp as a new coin. She set down a small thing wrapped in cloth and untied the knot with serious fingers. Inside was a metal disc, punched in the middle and threaded with twine. "My brother made it," she said. "It spins. He said it's a toy. I think it's for thinking." She wound the twine around the disc and pulled. The disc spun, humming low, catching the light the way the lid did in late afternoon. The sound grew steady, then slowed. The girl's face, for a second, held something Pandora knew well, the look of a person whose mind has just made room for a larger sky. "What do you want me to do with it?" Pandora asked. The girl shrugged. "I want to know if everything can be learned by spinning." "Not everything," Pandora said, "but a surprising amount." The girl nodded gravely and tucked the disc under the salt, under the rope, under the scrap. The box lifted a little when the twine brushed its side, like a cat acknowledging a familiar foot. "You'll come back," Pandora said. It wasn't a question. "I always do," the girl said, as if she had known Pandora her whole life and would keep knowing her after, when she was alone again. Pandora turned the room with her eyes the way you turn a field in your mind before planting, checking for stones, for shade, for what might grow. The chair by the window had worn spots that lined up with her hips. Her hands knew the table the way river stones know a certain current. Even the broom had learned her pace. She stood and stretched and felt the old bones complain in the polite way old bones do. Then she went to the box and put both palms flat on the lid. Warm, as always. She closed her eyes and let the warmth travel up her arms, across her chest, into the tired theatre of her ribs. Breath in, breath out. The hum thrummed along her bones, the same pitch that had haunted and annoyed and healed her for years. She waited. In the waiting, images came, not the cruel flashes of punishment she had once imagined, but the soft, stubborn pictures the world makes when it wants to be believed. A lane held through a storm because someone mixed salt into the seams. A roof didn't collapse because a boy saw a thread fray and tied a knot without permission. A jar carried water because someone refused to throw away what still carried its shape. A speech about gods failed to stop a fire, but a line of people did. A woman with snakes for hair told the truth to a man with a sword, and even though the next song called her a monster, the truth found other mouths. "Are you listening?" she whispered. The hum deepened, then returned to its old note. Hope did not promise. Hope never promised. It agreed to stay. For a week her knees ached more than usual, and food tasted like cardboard. A fever came and went. She kept the windows cracked while the sun moved across the walls and watched dust perform ballet in a beam of light. Her breath grew short and then shorter still. Neighbours left stew and begged her to eat. She ate enough to make them stop worrying and then closed her eyes again. Sleep stood nearer, watchful and patient. On the 7th night she woke to the kind of quiet that makes you check if the world is still here. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full. She could hear her own blood. She could hear the linen shift when she moved her hand. She could hear she smiled at this, the faintest spin of a metal disc as it moved on the table in a breath she hadn't taken. She wanted to sit up, but her body shook its head, so she made the room smaller. She gathered the air close. She blinked until the box was the only thing in front of her. "I've been worried," she admitted, "because you can say more honest things in the dark. Not about me, about whether I did it right." She let the quiet answer. "Because I didn't save anyone," she said. "I didn't stop the wars and I didn't feed the hungry. I didn't write the sentence that travelled. I just opened a thing." The hum lifted, the way a note does when a second singer decides to join. She thought of the girl and the spinning disc, of the rope and the salt and the shard and the scrap. She thought of strangers who had found the seam between terror and usefulness and put their fingers there to keep it from widening. She thought of the young woman she'd been, angry and curious and doomed to be blamed for everything wrong with the world simply because she had been given a trap and refused to decorate it. Maybe that was the work, she said softly. Not to keep the world safe from pain, but to keep it honest about it. To make room for company? She pushed herself forward on the chair until she could touch the lid again. The metal warmed her palm. Her palm warmed the metal. She did not lift it. She didn't need to. The room was already open. "People have been pouring into you for years," she murmured to the box. "Do you know that bits of their hope, bits of their stubbornness, bits of their love for each other disguised as rope or salt or words on wax, if anyone opens you now, you'll breathe them in?" Her arms trembled. She lowered her head until her forehead rested on the lid. The hum cradled the bones behind her eyes. She smiled, small and satisfied, the way a person smiles after finishing a long, plain job stacking wood, washing the last bowl, tying the last knot. "Stay," she said, not to the box but to everything that had leaned toward her all these years. "Stay even when I go." She slept. She woke to the faces of the women who had brought bread, heavy with fear and tenderness. She slept again. She woke to the boy with rope burns, now a man, taking the broom unasked and sweeping a floor that didn't need it. She slept. She woke to the salt girl, older now, arguing with a councilman about the price of a thing that could not be priced. She slept a last time and did not wake again. They buried her with the old words and the new ones. They set stones so the roof wouldn't fall in and brought food because grief has a mouth, too. After, someone started to carry the box toward the door. "No," the salt woman said, her voice low but made of iron. "It stays." They left it where it was, on the table, in the room that had learned to hold more than it was built for. The lid did not lift. It did not need to. People kept coming. They still kept leaving things: salt, rope, seeds, a coin with a hole, a drawing a child had made of a river bending around a grove. The box did what it had always done best. It held the habit of remembering. At night, when the valley quieted and the lamps went out one by one, the hum was there, a small music under everything else, the fan you forget you turned on, the ocean you only notice when it stops. Hope did not glow. Hope did not shout. It kept time. Tonight the house you're in has its own sounds. Maybe the heater ticks, or the fan hums, or the street breathes softly through the seams of the window. Maybe you can hear your neighbour's TV from 3 doors down, the laugh track too bright to be real. Maybe your room is quiet enough that your own heartbeat sounds like a small animal trying not to be seen. Wherever you are here, and you're not alone in the dark. You already met the gods in school, the versions with clean lines and easy morals. Those stories move fast. Real ones don't. Real ones are the kind that change pace when the door opens, that pause to tie a rope, that stop mid-sentence to wipe the edge of a jar and keep a flame from leaping. Real ones remember that people sleep and wake and eat and grieve and get tired of being terrified and make something anyway. You might be wondering what the point of all this is. That's fair. It's late. You've been holding your life all day. Here's the small, honest thing. The myth doesn't say out loud, but means with its whole body there was never a time when the world didn't hurt. There was never a time when people didn't make something out of the hurting. Pandora didn't invent pain. She named it. And in the naming, she made room for company. That's what you're hearing in the low hum under everything, the sound of 1,000 hands deciding small, useful things. Whispered, like a friend leaning closer. You don't have to fix all of it. You just have to keep a corner from catching fire. Think of the pieces you carry. Maybe you have a line from a book that lives in your pocket. Maybe you keep a photo of someone who would have loved the person you're becoming. Maybe you've learned to mix your own version of salt into the weak spots. Maybe you notice when a rope winds and put your weight where it matters for a second longer than is comfortable. That's all the myth is ever asking for: seconds strung together until they look like a life.